sexy right now, but there's another group of people that's not sexy to. So it's really all about the old saying of birds of a feather flock together. So if you're surrounding yourself around people that aren't interested in that, then absolutely you're not going to see it and you're not going to be attracted to it. You're not going to want it. But if you're surrounded around people that are an example of that lifestyle, then that's what you're gonna that's what you're gonna reflect.
I think what you just said, a little bit, in a way, was kind of contradictory, right? Because you said, well, there's traditional marriage, but then all the things that you described about things not being sexy anymore is essentially describing that we don't live in a traditional world. On top of that, I want to add this, like, what you may be describing, what you're describing probably as a traditional marriage isn't even traditional, probably. And that's how far we've gotten from traditional marriages. Like, for example, I hear a lot of women say, oh, the men used to pay all the bills, the men used to provide. The men were also the only ones who could get jobs at one point. They weren't competing in the marketplace with women. I hear the men say, and then at the same time, the same women that are saying that, they're not virgins. They drink alcohol. They have jobs. So it's like, marriage was created at a time where only men worked, women were virgins, they were given in marriage by their fathers who were home and present. Women are giving themselves in marriage today. There are so many weddings that happen where there's no father even walking the daughter down the aisle. But then we're making this the point that marriage is somehow still traditional. There's nothing traditional about that. And what we're doing is we're it's kind of like a little fixer upper. Like we're constantly slapping on new things to marriage to adjust it and make it work to the world that it's in now. But if you were to take the average marriage today and present it to the people in the past when marriage was more traditional, they would even consider those marriages to be horrible. They would look at these marriages like, what? Your wife is disrespecting you. Your husband is a bum. Like there will be so many their standards then were entirely different than the standards now, simply because of the society we live in. So I do understand your point, though. I think it is true, though, that there are a lot of people who don't want to put in necessarily the work or the dedication that comes with marriage. But I also think what's being overlooked is that we live in a world where they don't have to. People in the past were shamed if they weren't married. They were getting married to have sex. I mean, even in the Bible, Paul says it's better to marry than to, better to stay single as I do. But if basically better to marry than to burn. People in that time were marrying because they could not openly engage sexually with the opposite sex unless they were married. They would be stoned to death. They would be, hung in the public square. They would be called heretics. That's not the generation we live in anymore. We live in a generation where people can have sex with whom and whatever they want now. I made a joke in the chat earlier about when they were talking about women being satisfied, and I said my joke was like, yo, you can go buy any size and shape dick you want at the store. At the end of the day, that's the world we live in. We live in the world where during the pandemic, the number one product that was for sale on Amazon that they were shipping was dildos and vibrators. So we're not living in a world where people need to get married to be able to have a relationship, to be able to there were people who got married just to be able to go out on dates privately. You remember, there was traditional marriage. You didn't even date alone. You dated in groups. Your parents had to get to know this person. That's not the world we're living in now. So if we really want to talk about traditional marriage, we have to take it all the way traditional, because anything that's not that is exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that new age stuff. Like, we're living in a whole different world. And again, we're trying to piece it all together and make something work. But it's like we're living in a different world. And I say this all the time. I think what it is that I think there's a process called destroy and rebuild. I personally believe that people are too attached to the idea of marriage as it stood. And there needs to be a process societally of rebuilding what the idea of marriage is in general, because it has to be restructured to be able to apply to the world that we're currently living in. Or if not, it's going to continue to fail. And if we're being honest, it's failing. Most marriages end. More than 50% of them end in divorce. The ones that don't end in divorce, those people aren't necessarily happy. Those you have abuse, you have all type of stuff going on where even if they're sticking together for 30, 40 years, that doesn't mean that it's a success. So I'm gonna land there.
Let me challenge that real quick. So, I personally, when I say a traditional marriage, I'm not solely speaking on uh, the financial responsibilities. To me, traditional marriage is much more than that. Is much more than just a financial responsibility to this woman. A traditional marriage is you bringing forth life into the world. A traditional marriage is upholding to the gender roles of the man protecting his household and being the head of his household, the woman being the nurturer and the helpmeet to her husband. Those are, to me, are the traditional roles that I think should never go aside, regardless of what era it is that we live in. So I understand what you're saying, but for me, there are some things that I believe and stand firm on that I can't conform to what the world is saying that we should do. Because if I don't agree with that, then that's just not the type, that's not the perspective or the way that I perceive the world. So for traditional marriages is so much more than just the surface level of the woman staying at home and not working and the man paying all of the bills. Because even at some point, there were people, there were marriages back then that they weren't doing that. I don't believe that every single marriage was doing that, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't traditional. I think that it's the values that's traditional. It's the purpose behind marriage that's traditional, that should be upheld, and that is how you have a long lasting and healthy relationship. So I get what you're saying. I agree, because we absolutely live in a completely different world, but at the same time, it's what are your values, and how easily are you bendable to conform to this world. So that will be my rebuttal to it.
I,
Hey,
I
hold
think
on,
we're getting to a place where we're saying the same thing.
wait,
Can I just
wait,
ask him
wait.
one more?
Man,
Because I think we're at a place where we're like on the same page. Like we're basically
No,
saying the
we are.
same
No,
thing.
I agree. We on the
gotta
same
shut him.
page.
We gotta shut him.
I really just want to know, like, what would you describe as like the
Right, but then he
purpose?
gonna answer, and then you gonna have something. It's gonna keep going. It's gonna keep going.